Chapter 4. Number blank, Park Street, Bath. The horrible coughing on the stairs. Bath is a veritable cockpit of ghostdom. Its grey and venerable mansions are bound in ghosts. It is for its size the most psychic town in England. I say this because I have at my elbow no less than 25 well-authenticated stories of haunted houses in this city, a collection that is numerically superior to that of any other town in England, saving London, and to the ghost of London there is, as I stated at my recent lecture in Chandos Street, no end, positively no end. One evening last January, I read a paper on my superphysical experiences before an extremely intelligent and, I venture to say, appreciative audience of theosophists at their headquarters, Argyle Street, Bath. Among the number was a gentleman, quite a stranger I believe, who gave me his card and asked me to call on him the next day. I did so, and in the course of a very entertaining chat, he narrated to me the following story. Some years ago, some friends of mine, named Hartley, took a house in Park Street, which, as you may know, is built on the side of a hill. The house suited them. It was warm, dry, and in a very tolerable state of repair. It was also in a quiet and thoroughly respectable part of the town, and the rent was low, ridiculously low, so low indeed that they began to wonder why it was so low. Anxious to find out if their neighbors were equally fortunate in the matter of rent, they made inquiries, and learned to their astonishment that every other house in a row was let at more than double the price of theirs. Why was this? Was their landlord a philanthropist, a Carnegie, a madman, or what? Or did the house contain some subtle flaw they were yet to discover to their disadvantage? Perhaps very much to their disadvantage, for they were sufficiently worldly to discredit sentiment in business. Getting on the track of former tenants, they plied them with cautious questions. It was of no avail. The bait did not take. They could ascertain nothing. Then they gave up, and the truth at last leaked out. One dreary afternoon on a particularly dreary November, I believe it was the 4th of November, the Reverend Silas Weatherby, a vicar of the adjoining parish, called on them. They were delighted to see him. Mrs. Hartley was fond of the clergy. Her father and uncles and brothers were all in the church. She had lived in a clerical atmosphere from the day she was born. But the Reverend Silas Weatherby puzzled her. Had he been a deacon, a locum, or a newly ordained curate, she would have passed him over as excusably shy. But he was too old a stager for that. Why did he puzzle her then? He was orthodox, urbane, and she could stake her handkerchief. No small tattler of ecclesiastical gossip, but yet there was something amiss with him, something that made him pause, something that made him fidget. Probably she never would have found out why he behaved in such an odd manner, but for an unexpected occurrence. Without even so much as a rap, Bobby, their youngest boy, who is as a rule very shy before visitors, suddenly burst into the room. He was pale with excitement. "Oh, do come, Mummy," he cried. "There is such a queer old man in such a quaint dress on the staircase. He is coughing horribly. I fancy he must be very sick. Do come, Mummy, please." Mr. Weatherby's behavior was now odd in the extreme. Half rising from his seat and trembling all over, he pointed his finger violently at the door. "Run away, little man," he said. "Run away. No one is coughing now. Your invalid has recovered. He is gone. Go directly and shut the door behind you. Mind, shut the door, and keep clear of the staircase." And Bobby, completely at a loss of what to make of this despotic stranger, beat a hasty retreat. Mrs. Hartley, disregarding the pleading look from her husband, was about to expostulate. Like the majority of modern mothers, her tender, I might say unsound, sensibilities could not bear to see her offspring treated in any but the most deferential manner. The Reverend Silas, however, forestalled her. With a wave of his hand that was as eloquent as it was peremptory, he completely took the wind out of her sails, and before she had time to recover from her surprise, he had commenced. "For heaven's sake, Mrs. Hartley," he said in a semi-whisper, leaning forward in such a manner as emphasized the mysterious air he had suddenly assumed, "for heaven's sake, leave this house as quickly as you can." "There now, Arthur," Mrs. Hartley exclaimed, the angry expression in her eyes being replaced with a mixture of triumph and curiosity. "There now, didn't I tell you all along something was wrong with the place?" Drains, I suppose, her husband said mournfully. Drains or rats, and I do hate moving. Neither one nor the other, the Reverend Silas whispered. No, the house is haunted. At this announcement, Mrs. Hartley gave a slight ejaculation of terror, an ejaculation which, reduced to its constituent parts, might be found to consist of affectation, fear, and no small amount of pleasure, the latter engendered by the glamour of something both enigmatical and fashionable. What's it haunted by? Teapots? Mr. Hartley muttered with a contemptuous movement of his mouth. If it's not haunted by teapots now, it will be some day, for that new maid of yours, my dear, is always breaking them. She smashed 2 since yesterday, and if you examine this one closely, you will observe that the spout is already chipped. Mrs. Hartley puckered her dainty brows into most alarming frown. Really, Arthur, how mundane you are, she said loftily. Then turning to Mr. Weatherby, my husband is, as you see, one of those solid individuals who believes in nothing till he sees it. And not always then, Arthur murmured, gazing intently at the parson as the latter was about to pour the contents of the cream jug into his cup. Everything that appears to the eye white and sticky is not cream. Some animals have brains, even pigs, and some dairymen are frauds, most of them. Good gracious me, the Reverend Silent cried hastily, replacing the jug. You surely don't mean to insinuate— He doesn't mean anything, Mrs. Hartley interrupted with considerable impatience. He is unusually silly this afternoon, so pray excuse him, and with a regular 6-month in Paris accent, Revenons à nos moutons, s'il vous plaît. I am anxious to hear about the ghost. Mr. Weatherby looked a trifle sulky. He fought shy of the skeptics, and he no longer enjoyed his tea. Now mind, I don't ask you to believe me, he began, although there are plenty of people in this parish who will confirm what I say. But 80 or 100 or so years ago, a son poisoned his father in this very house. The manner of the poisoning was quite orthodox, arsenic and apple dumplings. There have been many parallel cases, chiefly, I believe, in Liverpool. Arsenic, being an irritant, causes considerable vomiting. Hence the old man must have had several attacks of sickness prior to the one that terminated his existence as he was traveling downstairs to fetch a doctor. He died, it is said, in excruciating agony on the landing at the top of the first flight of stairs. And is it his ghost that haunts the house? Mrs. Hartley hazarded. The reverend gentleman nodded. Just so, he said, and it was this apparition, undoubtedly, that your little boy saw just now. It always appears on November 4th, the anniversary of the murder, and Mr. Weatherby was going to add something that, judging from the increased solemnity of his voice, would have been very impressive when Mr. Hartley cut in. Then at all events we shall have a reprieve, a year's undisputed possession, subject to no interference on the part of the spook. Mr. Whatever's his name, he laughed irreverently. You certainly won't catch me giving up this lease for any so immaterial a reason. No, thank you. I cannot get as good a bargain as this every day in the week. The Reverend Silas rose to go. Very well, then, he said, bowing stiffly. I could say more, but I won't. I am sorry I have said as much. Some skeptics are never convinced. Some skeptics do not wish to be convinced. Some skeptics may be convinced, but prefer to appear unconvinced. I am no metaphysician. I will not attempt to classify you. I will only say, may you never be afraid. I trust Mrs. Hartley, at all events, is not a skeptic. I hope she is not a psychic, especially not a psychic in this house. I wish you good day. He did not wish us good luck, Mr. Hartley explained as the door banged. By Jove, I have no patience to listen to such stuff. Haunted, indeed. But his wife shook her head. Skepticism is one thing, and what Bobby saw is another, she argued. You can't get over that, Arthur. Now, are we going to do the right thing for the children in remaining here? In all matters concerning her children, Mrs. Hartley's instincts were always acute. 1 or 2 of them were babies, even younger than Bobby. On this occasion, however, Mr. Hartley held his own. Bobby, he reasoned, must have had the daymare, and even if he did see anything, no harm has come of it. You must recollect, my dear, he observed, that I have not been doing over well on the stock exchange lately. Moving is a costly thing, and if I spend money in one way, I must recoup it in another. which means no new dress for you and no Weston-upon-Mare for the children. The validity of this logic was not lost upon Mrs. Hartley. She reflected, and then with her customary adroitness gave a turn to the conversation. It was once again November, the 4th of November, and the staircase incident of a year ago now seemed remote and improbable. It was, however, upmost in the minds of both Mr. and Mrs. Hartley, though they both pretended to have forgotten it. They had neither seen Mr. Weatherby again, nor had they mentioned the appearance of the ghost to anyone. It was really of so little consequence. It was a wet afternoon, wet and chilly, and as neither Mr. and Mrs. Hartley had any particular inducement to face the elements, they decided to stay indoors, Mrs. Hartley reclining in an easy-chair before the drawing-room fire, whilst her husband seated himself in like manner before a blazing hearth in the dining-room. They tried to read, they could not. They tried to sleep, they could not. And somehow they felt that they ought to go and look at the children, but they would not. And so whiled away the hours in this half-hearted and wholly unsatisfactory manner. It seemed the sudden opening of the nursery door first disturbed Mrs. Hartley, and fancying she heard someone steal gently across the landing, she called out, but there was no reply. So, thinking it was fancy, she was about to settle down again when the sound of someone coughing made her heart beat quickly. Who could it be? Not the nurse. The nurse wouldn't cough in such a deep and hoarse manner. Nor yet Arthur. She could recognize his cough anywhere. Hark! There it was again. Cough, cough, cough. Just as if someone was being sick. Ah, who could that someone be? Who indeed? But, and fearing lest one of the children might be on the stairs, she overcame a momentary weakness and sallied forth. What she saw froze her with horror. At the top of the hall staircase was a figure of a man clad in costume of the 18th century, long maroon tailcoat with vest to match, knee breeches, and coarse yellow stockings. Mrs. Hartley couldn't see his face, as he was in a recumbent position and vomiting horribly. Looking up at him from below, her eyes big with pity and wonder, not fear, was Kitty, the Hartleys' youngest child. Catching sight of her mother, Kitty cried, "Oh, Mummy, do come down. The poor man is awful ill. Do help him. I'll come too," and suited the action to her words. The little mite prepared to ascend. No sooner, however, had she set a foot on the staircase when the old man slipped and, falling sideways, plunged through the air. Making sure Kitty would be hurt, and regardless of the fact she was merely clutching at a phantom, Mrs. Hartley appears to have made frantic efforts to stay the disaster. Whether in her agitation she tried to go down the stairs too quickly, or whether in her anxiety to save her child she lost her head and simply leaped forward, it is impossible to say. She herself always declares that the stairs collapsed under her. Anyhow, she fell, and crashing into Kitty, literally crushed the life out of her. Mr. Hartley found mother and child lying together at the foot of the stairs, and although he saw no sign of any apparition, he was no longer a skeptic. His wife recovered. At least she is alive, though I am told some internal complaint, the result of the catastrophe, makes her long for death. Some months after Kitty's burial, when time had to a certain extent mollified the poignancy of suffering caused by her death, Mr. Hartley received a letter of condolence from the Reverend Silas Weatherby. The greater portion of the epistle was simply a formal declaration of sympathy, but the concluding lines, inasmuch as they bear on haunting, are worth repeating. The weather divine wrote as follows. "If you recollect, at our last meeting I gave you to understand that I had something further to tell you, re the occult disturbances in your late abode. You will probably treat my statement with contempt, badly concealed under cover of a pretty pasquinade, but I am prepared to run the gauntlet of your skepticism in order to relieve my conscience. What I would have told you had I not been silenced, culpably my own, by your ridicule, is this. The appearance of the sick man had always been followed by some dire calamity, whenever any attempt has been made to set even as much as 1 foot on the staircase during the manifestations. Hence my warning to Bobby. I cannot, of course, explain to you why a phenomenon of this sort should entail physical disaster any more than I can elucidate the mystery of the ghost candles of Wales, or the banshees of Ireland, between which manifestations and the phenomena in question there is a strong analogy. But should you feel sufficiently interested in the subject to look for further information, or even be sufficiently dubious to demand testimony, I will with pleasure provide you with an abundance of creditable corroborations, both documentary and oral. But Mr. Hartley was perfectly satisfied. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. The Minery, Devon. The Man with the Bucket. Hotel Ritz, Vienna, February 10th, 1908. Dear Mr. O'Donnell, in reply to your inquiry as to that psychic experience I had in Devon, I will do my best to make the affair explicit, although, as you know very well, I do not pose as a scribe. Well, it took place 3 years ago, June 15th, 1905. Shall I ever forget that date? My friends, the Maitlands, had only just taken the Minery, a pretty yellow stone villa, modern in every respect. It stood some few yards from the road and was fronted by a lawn, bordered with honeysuckle, sweet peas, and Devon roses. I tell you this to impress upon you the fact that there is positively nothing to suggest of ghosts either in the grounds or building, the latter being as unlike the orthodox haunted house as one can imagine. If anything should have warned me, it was the hesitating and half-nervous manner, so unlike herself, with which Doris Maitland showed me my room. "I do hope you will like it and be comfortable, dear," she said, as she stood for a moment on the threshold, a strangely perplexing expression in her eyes, and one which I couldn't then interpret. "Be sure to tell us if you don't, and we will move you at once." "Why shouldn't I?" asked in unfeigned astonishment. "It is delightfully snug and sunny. A south aspect, a charming view, and oh, the most delightful of dainty furniture. Why, Dora, I should indeed be an ungrateful sybarite if I didn't revel in it." And Dora forced a smile. The hot summer days drove us into the open. We got up early and went to bed late. Being a man and fond of cricket and fishing, you would hardly appreciate the life we led. We are women of the old school, and consequently spent all our time at home on the lawn, plying our needles, possibly at the same time chewing chocolates or discussing our favorite books. Motoring and golf we left to others. The 15th of June was warm and sultry. We had been invited to spend the evening at the adjoining vicarage. Dora had a headache, her mother was a chronic invalid, and so, willy-nilly, I went alone. It was a stupid affair, mediocre music, still more mediocre supper, and bridge. Fancy bridge in a sleepy country parsonage. Fancy bridge anywhere. I hate bridge. The guests were of the usual sort, prudish, prosy, and plain. A widow and twins, the Miss Somebodies of somewhere, a curate, a doctor, and a lawyer, with the exception of the last, could be more respectable. What more dull, deadly dull? They were all, as men I mean, very anxious I should play cards. But for once in a way I made myself positively disagreeable, and sat alone. 11 o'clock came. It was time to go. I rose with alacrity, emitting, I believe, with the intensity of joy the formal expressions of regret. The vicar accompanied me as far as the gates, bidding me a bland good night. He retraced his steps with a sigh of relief. Mrs. Maitland had left a light burning in the hall. I turned it out, and taking up my candle, proceeded to my bedroom, and was beginning to undress when a strange thing happened. My bedroom door, which I felt positively certain I had locked, slowly opened, and a man peered in. I can see him now. Strong, regular features with piercing dark and somewhat sinister eyes that were in marked contrast to the iron-gray brows and wavy, neatly parted hair. The chin was square, the head well-shaped. He was a handsome man, yet he did not please me. I was frightened. For some seconds he glanced furtively around the room, his eyes finally resting on the bedstead, which he regarded in a manner that made my flesh creep. Who could he be? What on earth did he want? Terrified lest he should see me, though why it was he hadn't done so, I couldn't for the life of me imagine. I kept shrinking backwards into the alcove where I hung my dresses, in the wild hope that they would afford me a safe hiding-place. Presently, to my unutterable relief, he disappeared, and I heard his footsteps tiptoeing gently down the staircase. Here then was my chance to escape. Hardly dared to breathe, I rushed frantically to the door. Heaven preserve me, it was locked again, and tearing it open, I made directly for the passage leading to Dora's room. On my way I heard a noise that fascinated and kept me still. The clang of a bucket. What could a man be doing with a bucket at this time of night? A bucket! And on that staircase, so daintily furnished with velvet pile? Breathlessly I watched him ascend, his step light and springing, his head bent low, and the bucket clanging each time he mounted. Clang, clang, clang. The agony I suffered, for I could now only conclude he was either a madman or a burglar, was indescribable. I dreaded all the things, the act of being seen, of encountering a glance from those evil eyes. Nearer and nearer he came. One more step, and he stood in the little lobby outside my bedroom door. What was he going to do? To enter my room or follow me? My heart stood still. A cold sweat burst out all over me. I essayed to shrink and implore the aid of Dora. My throat dried up, my tongue stuck to the palate of my mouth. I was speechless, helpless, hopeless. Another yard and the uncanny stranger would have had me in his clutches. At the crucial moment, heaven heard my silent prayer. He halted. I was saved. With one hand on the handle, he slowly, very slowly, opened the door, and crouching down on his hands and feet, crept quietly in, muffling the sound of the bucket. Incongruous sight, a madman, or a burglar with a common and everyday bucket. In the ecstasies of salvation, I gave a weak, hysterical laugh. A madman with a bucket. And what a bucket! After this little display of emotion, and being now in the full possession of all my motive faculties, I promptly fled, not pausing for the fraction of a second till I reached the bedside of Dora and had shaken her to wakefulness. She listened to my story with blanched cheeks, beseeching me with terror in her eyes to make sure the door was locked and that her Bible was well in evidence. Her fears adding to my own, I now concluded that there was some horrible mystery attached to what I had just witnessed. I hastily scrambled into bed, and drawing the clothes well up over our heads, begged her to confide in me in secret. I hardly know how to explain it, Kate, she whispered. You will be so shocked. I'm afraid you will blame us horribly for putting you in that room, but to tell you the truth, we had nowhere else, at least nowhere suitable, as the ceilings and walls are sadly out of repair. You see, we bought this house at a very low price. It had stood empty for a good many months. It was in a sad state of dilapidation, and the owner was only too glad to get rid of it. After we had settled in, he coolly informed us that it was reputed to be haunted, that the remains of a woman had been found under the cement of the back kitchen floor. It is now nicely tiled, and that on the anniversary of his committal, the tragedy was reported to be enacted in all of its grim details. And was she murdered in my room? I inquired. It is supposed so, Dora murmured. There is a telltale stain which nothing will efface under the carpet, and the former tenants are reported to have seen all you have witnessed, and rather more. And the murderer, what of him? I asked, thinking with a shudder of his eyes. No one knows anything, Dora whispered, edging closer to me as we heard a distant clang. It is only surmised he was her husband. She was quite a stranger here, and he was never caught. But the bucket, what could he want with such an absurd thing as a bucket? As I heard it clanging from below, I gave a ghastly chuckle. For heaven's sake, don't laugh, Dora shivered. They found that bucket. He had used it for transporting her remains. Please remember me and company to all. Ever yours sincerely, Kathleen M. Dean. End chapter 5. Chapter 6, Thurlow Hall, near Exeter. Fire, fire, bring me fire. The following story was related to me by Miss Constance Delany. It is given as near as possible in her own words. The early spring of 1898 was, I dare say you remember, exceptionally fine. So fine indeed that my mother, a chronic sufferer from rheumatism, determined to remain in England rather than going, as was her custom, to the Riviera. We did not want, however, to stay in town. An unusually gay Christmas having given us an appetite for the country, so we sublet our flat and took Thurlow Hall, furnished, on a 3 months' lease. We had never been to Devon, and we had heard much of its beauty. We were disappointed. Possibly, being of foreign extraction, I am prejudiced, but in my opinion the scenery of Devon is almost, if not quite, as inferior to that of Belgium and Switzerland, as the manners of its peasants are inferior to those of the corresponding class of continentals. The West Country rustics did not impress us favorably. On our arrival they welcomed us with gapes and stares and boorish grunts. Not a few of them giggled, whilst others, slouching up to our boxes, read the labels and muttered disparaging things about foreigners. We were told it was the spirit of independence, a spirit presumably fostered by the democratic teachings of the board school which, if it had accomplished nothing else, had effectually taught the children to be rude. The pretty simplicity and deferential mannerisms described as characteristic of these villagers by mid-Victorian writers had become obsolete. Curtsying now regarded as infra-dig. No one touched their hats or moved aside for ladies, and the colloquial sir and ma'am had long since given place to a familiar and condescending Mr. or Mrs., as the case may be. In Cornwall, we were informed the manners of the people are even worse, and if that is a fact, one can hardly believe it possible. I am quite certain we shall never cross the Tamar. Fortunately, we had taken two of our favorite servants with us, namely Maria and Eugenie. The latter my mother's own maid, a capable person who could turn her hand to anything, the former a clever little cook we had imported from our own country. But for this foresight on my part, I do not know how my mother could have managed to exist. She is even more fastidious than I. She cannot bear anything coarse or uncouth. In comparison, a local servant would have made purgatory seem pleasant. I'm afraid you will conclude we are rather hard to please. Perhaps we are somewhat exacting, but we cannot help it. We are women of the old school, may I add of gentle birth, who claim to the full all the privileges of our sex and station. Besides, we offered a good sum for the house, and we expected to be treated fairly. According to the advertisement, the hall was furnished. It was in reality nothing of the sort. Can a house in which there is neither bookcase nor bathroom be said to be furnished? Though standing alone on a fairly large piece of ground, I cannot truthfully say a garden. It might well have been called semi-detached, for we searched in it in vain to find a whole piece of furniture. Marie and Eugenie are smart young women. They pride themselves on being slim and elegant. Imagine, then, their disgust when the kitchen chairs actually collapsed under them. I, too, had a grievance. Without conceit, I may say it is not in my nature to be clumsy. How was it, then, that I broke 3 cups, a saucer, and a cream jug within the short space of half an hour? The reason was obvious enough. The cups were all cracked, the saucers damaged, and the jug should have been labeled "Beware of the handle." Even moderately disfigured china is my mother's pet aversion. How she suffered under these circumstances I cannot attempt to describe. But the plate! I have heard of gold plate, silver plate, copper plate, brass plate, and electroplate. But none of these could associate with this mongrel species. These odds and ends we were called upon to use. It was indeed an enigma, and I hate enigmas, especially when they are not worth the trouble to solving. Luckily, the substitutes were easily obtainable. I wired for a complete supply of plate from home, after which the motley crew of hirelings were no longer in evidence. And the carpets! I have always thought such luxuries, even the most costly, a doubtful blessing. These were undoubtedly an unmixed evil. Fortunately, we were able to dispense with them. The floors underneath were of polished oak, and with these we were greatly taken. True, we were somewhat puzzled to account for certain irregularities in the boards, but on the whole I think we should have been more astonished had we found them intact. Could we, by any means, make this place tenantable? Marie and Eugenie are brave and forgiving girls. In spite of their recent adventure, they had never been so insulted in their lives. They thought it possible. Mother and I were doubtful. We hired all the furniture there was to be hired from the village. We engaged by day the only prepossessing and respectable women it contained, and we were to settle down and pretend we enjoyed it. From the beginning it was a fiasco. We were miserable, and to add to our distress, or rather, to fill to overflowing our cup of misfortune, the weather became miserable too. It began to rain. What was there to hope for now? Nothing. What was there to do now? Nothing. Nothing but sit at the window and gaze at the dreary lawn, shut off from the road by a hideous wall, or to flit about from room to room, wringing one's hands like a distracted phantom. A phantom! I did not believe in phantoms when I came to Thurlow. I treated the unknown with the blind levity of a Voltaire. I was inconsequently skeptical. I had been born psychic. Though I was sublimely unconscious of it, the dawn of my awakening was at hand. Though the house was undesirable in so many ways, cold, bare, comfortless, dilapidated, it was not without interest. It was old with the antiquity of 2 or more centuries, and age is always interesting. There were rooms in it, narrow, rectangular rooms, darkened by Virginia creeper that dropped their crimson foliage over the diamond panes, rooms the very air of which seemed charged with the shades of old-world wits and savants. In my imagination the house had once been a school. The severity of the walls, the coldness of their neat yellow stones suggested it. I even went so far as to fancy I could discern ink stains on the skirting boards, and who but schoolboys would desecrate a floor with ink stains? The predominating feature of the house was undoubtedly the staircase. It was the first thing one noticed on entering. There was no escaping it. Confronting the door in the very middle of the hall, it stood there like some gray and massive sentinel, and barred the way. One wondered how it ever got there. It was so disproportionately large for the house. It was masterful, aggressive, fascinating. Marie declared there was no getting away from it, that it lived, and it was made of stone. There was no doubt about it now. The hall had indeed been a school. Would anyone but a pedagogue have a stone staircase? Ugh! My mother felt a twinge of rheumatism the moment she set eyes on it. It was curiously wanting in proportion, consistently of barely a dozen steps. It was most uncomfortably steep and of the most unnecessary width. I compared it with some strange squatting animal, a comparison that grew on me the longer I remained in the house. At the top of the staircase was a gallery, protected by high rails, which I discovered connected the used and disused portions of the house. In the latter there were some rooms that we did not care to inhabit. There were a few we were even unable to explore. They were locked. I felt no curiosity about them. They were certain to be both commonplace, prosaic, and dusty. Every time I passed them I smelt dust, and I cannot endure a particle of dust. If I had believed any of them to be a library, I might have been tempted to pick the lock. I am passionately fond of books, that is to say, of some books. When I am exiled in the country and it is always raining. I was in search of a book that I had laid down somewhere when I crossed the hall one afternoon and left my mother dozing in a big armchair before the drawing-room fire. Marie said she had seated on the oak settle, most likely, for I often took my book and lounged on it. You'd see I had grown fond of the oak settle naturally, for it was the only piece of furniture in that monster house that stirred in me any friendly feeling whatever. But Marie must have been dreaming. It certainly was not there. I would have called to Marie to come and help me search for it, had I not remembered that she and Eugenie had gone into the village to do a little shopping on their own account. They laugh in their grandest manner at those silly little shops, but with a true woman's instinct, they cannot resist buying. I felt indignant, provoked, angry. Never had I wanted to read so much, and never have I been at such a loss to find a book. Oh, I recollected there was one upstairs, an ancient and dusty edition of Eugene Aram. Proof positive this that the place was once a school. Would anyone save a schoolmaster read Eugene Aram? I had seen it lying on the floor of a disused cupboard, alone and forsaken, a solitary relic of the academical bookshelf. Were I in a library, Eugene Aram would probably be the last book I would choose to read. Leighton's tales are horrible. I abominate horrors. I thought of the staircase. I glanced at it. It was really very dark. I shuddered. I did not understand why I shuddered, unless it was on account of a draught. Of course, a draught. The house was full of draughts. The hour was late, the afternoon was cold, it was March, and undoubtedly a door was open somewhere. The book was not worth the trouble. I was overtired. I would return to my mother. This I was actually preparing to do when the sudden appearance of a light made me pause. It came from the disused wing overhead. I can assure you I wanted very much to go to my mother. I would have given all I possessed to have gone to my mother. I could not. I could not stir. That light enthralled me. I had never seen such a light, such a queer, unaccountable light, a light that to anyone less skeptical might have seemed an unnatural light. Perhaps it was an unnatural light, and I laughed. But what in the name of heaven could it be? Drawing rapidly nearer and quickly assuming the appearance and proportions of a fire, it filled me with the most unusual, the most preposterously unusual doubts and fears. And for the first time I detected it, it was accompanied by an incongruous, though perfectly intelligible sound, the sound of someone tapping with all their might, tapping with a pair of high-heeled shoes. Aghast at this discovery, my perplexities increased. I was vainly endeavoring to extricate myself from a chaotic quagmire of unpleasant thoughts, when a scream, the very intensity of which made me tremble, echoed and re-echoed throughout the house. "Fire! Fire! Bring me fire!" These words, apparently so strangely paradoxical, were repeated with renewed vigor and anguish, the voice after each effort dying away in the most appalling and piteous wail. The screams were coming nearer, but before I had time to realize the tumult that was so close to hand, or to fortify myself against the tableau, I now had every reason to anticipate. A girl, her hair and dress a mass of lurid flames, came rushing frantically into the gallery. The spectacle she presented was so satanically awful that I immediately crossed myself. An indescribable thrill of terror ran through me. I knew I was actually in the presence of an apparition. Nothing earthly could possibly have produced a similar, anyway equivalent effect. Staring at me through the yellow inferno of flames was a woman's face that, despite its horribly contorted features, was amazingly and uniquely beautiful. the perfect regularity of the Jewish lineaments being strikingly enhanced by the whiteness of the teeth, the blueness of the eyes. The latter came upon me as a further shock. Though very lovely, both in their excessive length and hue, they did not match that style of face. To have done so, they should have been black or brown, and their expression was repellent. I say repellent. I might with great accuracy say hellish, for I saw in them the mirror of a sinful soul, of a very sinful soul. I could form no idea as to her dress. The blaze effectively hid everything save the face, but from the partial glimpse I caught of a pair of satin shoes, I surmised she was in some sort of ballroom costume. The duration of her transit, though to me an eternity, could not, I fancy, have occupied more than a few seconds. Still gazing at me and beating the air with its hands, the phantom rushed shrieking onward, disappearing with the impetus of a tornado in the inhabited portion of the house. I had no further use for Eugene Aram. I returned to my mother. The same phenomenon was witnessed by Marie and Eugenie, respectively, within the next 3 days. On the 4th we left. Had we remained, there might have been a fatality. We were all genuinely frightened, and Mother is an invalid, a very nervous invalid. Perhaps you feel inclined to say it was all a matter of nerves. What more likely? We were an isolated quartet of over-imaginative women. Or you might say that some story we heard in connection with the house suggested these occult demonstrations. Do not be premature. We only heard a few weeks ago that the hall had a reputation of being haunted, and it is now several months since we left Thurlow. Our informant, a former tenant, was, we have every reason to believe, a person of indisputable veracity and common sense. In short, a person quite incapable of inventing any such story as the following, which he kindly narrated for our satisfaction. It appears from what he told us, his manuscript is still in my bureau, that Thurlow Hall once belonged to Mrs. Purvis, an old lady with one child, Charles. Charles was, of course, the apple of her eye. Charles ruled the house. Everyone must obey Mr. Charles. Mr. Charles could do nothing wrong until, in the heyday of his youth, in the season of wild oats, he unexpectedly fell in love with a Gaiety girl, Phyllis, no one remembered her other name, and married her, and that was very wrong. His mother was indignant, furious, not with Charles, of course, but with that creature, Phyllis. Phyllis had inveigled him into marrying her. Phyllis would bring eternal disgrace on the family. Phyllis would run away with another man and ruin him. Ruin Charles. And the fond mother grew despondent, very despondent. So despondent indeed that unkind neighbors said she was mad. They were wrong. The despondency was only a reaction. She suddenly cheered up, and all was apparently forgiven and forgotten. Charles and Phyllis were invited to spend Christmas at Thurlow. They went. Very naturally they went. Charles overjoyed at the prospect of displaying the Purvis estate to his charming wife. His mother welcomed Phyllis effusively. She made her feel thoroughly at home. She expressed an ardent desire to see her in her bridal robes. Phyllis consented. What else could she do? She had been a Gaiety girl. She had lived for admiration. Arrayed in her wedding garments, she entered Mrs. Purvis's room, surprising the old lady in the act of lighting an oil lamp, a rather shaky oil lamp filled to the brim with oil. Phyllis was radiant. Her sole thought was of the sensation she would create at the coming Christmas festivities. Had she been less absorbed, she might have noticed the hand tremble that raised the lamp. She might even have been on her guard. But vanity as well as love is blind. Phyllis accepted Mrs. Purvis's profuse expressions of admiration and delight in good faith. They were, of course, both genuine and natural. They were, moreover, her due. The bride was intent on examining herself in the mirror. Her mother-in-law approached her from behind and, bending suddenly forward, deliberately hurled the lamp on the train of her dress. There was a loud crash and explosion, and the wedding dress was on fire. No one was at hand to render assistance, Charles and his servants having been slyly inveigled out of the house, and the only response to her screams were loud peals of laughter from her now wholly insane mother-in-law. It was small wonder that the poor girl lost her head and, craving water, cried in her agony, "Bring me fire! Oh, bring me fire!" In that mad rush from the room along the disused corridors, her one endeavor would appear to have been to reach her bedroom. Perhaps she had forgotten that Charles had gone out, but her efforts were frustrated by the fiendish fury of the flames. The amount of oil on her dress must have made it blaze like a furnace. She had barely crossed the gallery into the opposite wing of the house before her scorched and smoldering limbs gave way, and falling to the ground she was speedily burned to ashes. Her supreme and final agony being summed up in a despairing cry, so loud and piercing that it was even heard outside by Charles. Not daring to approach the house alone, Charles summoned one of the villagers, and keeping well in their rear, gingerly accompanied them across the lawn to the front entrance. There they were met by Mrs. Purvis, chuckling horribly. Corridors, gallery, and staircase were all in flames. Had it not been for the opportune arrival of the vicar, the whole place would have been consumed. Thanks, however, to his vigor and level-headedness, the fire was eventually extinguished, and although the damage done was considerable, the bulk of the property remained unscathed. No trace of the unfortunate Mrs. Charles Purvis being found, the precise manner of her death for many years remained a mystery. But the erratic babbling of her mother-in-law supplied material for certain conjectures, which were afterward confirmed by the lucid and exhaustive confession of the old lady, who regained her reason on her deathbed. Though a thorough restoration of the property was effected, Charles would never live in the Hall. A long series of unsatisfactory tenancies succeeded the events I have just related, and the story of a ghost has at length come to stay. N.B. I have good reason in believing that the house is still, August 1908, haunted. Most probably this will always be the case. The end.